And I am a QSide Fellow. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Lourdes Vera, PhD candidate and researcher at Northeastern University and coordinating committee member of the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative, presenting on a community-based tool to measure hydrogen sulfide near oil and gas development.
Hi, everyone. Just getting set up a bit here. Just a minute. Okay. So I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and I'm also part of the Social Science Environmental Health Research Institute at Northeastern University. Today, I'm going to be talking about a project I've been working on with my advisor, Sarah Wylie, and many other researchers in the Wylie Environmental Data Justice Lab, including Karnes, who has done a lot of work with us, and she's a PhD student at York University in Toronto, Canada. So what we've been doing is citizen science, and we've been developing a do-it-yourself scientific tool for rural communities harmed by oil and gas development. And I'm going to be taking you across the United States and Canada to Texas, Saskatchewan, and Beaver, Wyoming. And this is where we've done work monitoring a neurotoxic gas called hydrogen sulfide. Now, first I'm going to talk to you about the harms posed by oil and gas industry. And a lot of the people living nearby are in rural communities, and it disproportionately, well, in general, environmental hazards disproportionately affect communities of color. And in Karnes, it's mostly Latinx folks. So I started this research in 2015, shortly after a well owned by the company in Canada exploded and covered a quarter mile of land in oil and proprietary chemicals, leaving stretches of land brown and dead. And residents, including ones I work with, were forced to live in nearby motel rooms. They couldn't return to their homes, and their homes were guarded by industry workers in pickup trucks. One of the people I work with, her livestock was killed, and still she frequently deals with animals dying on her property. And community members living near oil and gas facilities, like these two families, experience issues with their health. And they, so when oil and gas development really grew in Texas, and that started in 2011 and really peaked in 2015. And this is South Central Texas, around 50 miles southeast of San Antonio. They were really struggling. And the family on the left, they were interviewed for a report by the national organization Earthworks and said, I can't put into words, because there are no words to express my anger of being placed into this hell with no escape. Each new flare or rig put up around my home leaves me standing there staring and crying. And another family that I've worked with said to the Center for Public Integrity, there's nothing we can do. Nobody is listening to us. They're not going to stop, so we have to live with it or leave. This is my home and I hate it here. And the first family has had over 18 oil wells drilled and fracked within 1 mile of the home. And the family on the right lives within 2.5 mile radius of 50 drill sites. And many people in this area live within a 5 mile, or not 5 mile, a half mile, 0.5 mile distance to an oil or gas well. And especially vulnerable groups such as people in prisons, schools, nursing home, and adult and child daycares live within a half mile to wells. These risks and live with these risks every day. And including an ICE immigrant detention facility and the Karnes County Correctional Center and a nursing home are within a quarter mile of the well. And the picture that I showed you of the blowout, that stretched a quarter of a mile. So these people are especially at risk. And these maps show different towns within the county of Karnes, Texas. And just across areas with oil and gas development, residents often face inattention from state agencies and industry. Another community member I work with, Mr. Garcia, told me that he and his friend Luis were riding around yesterday and there were so many spots smoking like a chimney. TCQ, which is the Texas State Environmental Agency and industry, don't care. They have the politicians in their hip pocket. It's like in The Godfather. You have to have politicians in your back pocket, like mafiosos. Industry spends so much money on lobbying, part of it is a bribery. So I set out on the journey with residents to answer the question, what is in the air that might be making people sick? And we started with, in the Wylie lab, even before I arrived, the Wylie lab started with hydrogen sulfide, and I'm going to call it H2S throughout the presentation. H2S is commonly known as sewer or sour gas and mainly produced by bacterial decomposition, so it's naturally present everywhere at low levels. But it's commonly emitted by sewage treatment plants or paper mills and then oil and gas production. And since it's heavier than air, it often lingers around low-lying areas such as ditches or in valleys, and it's often recognized by its rotten egg smell and corrosive properties. There are other health effects that include eye irritation, damage to one's sense of smell, respiratory irritation, and at 750 or 1,000 parts per million, which is the unit that we measure it in, death. And while these are short and acute, short-term acute effects, only a few scientific studies address low-dose, long-term effects such as chronic respiratory or neurological symptoms. So we've been developing a do-it-yourself tool for measuring hydrogen sulfide, and it contains a punched-out circle of light-sensitive photopaper coated with a layer of silver gelatin. I don't know if any of you have ever worked in a dark room before, but it's the silver gelatin on the photopaper that darkens when it reacts to gases that contain sulfur. And these circles are placed into 2-inch black round film canisters, which you see in the top right corner. And these canisters cost as little as 59 cents and prevent light from reaching the photopaper when it's outside in the field. So after the tool is set out in an area of concern, such as public roads, parks, or residents' property near sources of H2S, the photopaper is removed from its canister in darkroom and placed in filter so it no longer reacts to light. So this tool was originally developed by a volcanologist, Claire Horwell in New Zealand, where she placed the canisters in residents' mailboxes off the shore of Lake Rotorua, a volcanic caldera with geothermal activity that spews high amounts of H2S. Now, what's really novel about this method is that it's not only do-it-yourself, anyone can order these supplies from a photography store, but it also maps the data. And it's easier, it's easier to interpret than just numbers on charts. So she characterized this as Lake Rotorua as a source of H2S. And then we picked up on this method in order to map sources of H2S around oil and gas facilities. So I just wanted to show you a more detailed diagram of how we prepare and analyze the photopaper. If anyone watching this knows of any H2S sources near them that they're concerned with, you can talk to me or email me after, and I can show you some how-to guides on how to make this. And anyone can do steps 1 to 3 at home in a makeshift darkroom. I've even made a darkroom in a bathroom with no windows using a red light on my cell phone to see what I was doing. And like I described before, we cut the paper into circles, put them in the canister, put them out in the field and expose them to the air, usually over a week. And then put them in the fixer. And once they're dry, we can see how dark they are. And so what we did for a scientific study is sent them to get XRF, sent them to the Harvard School of Public Health to get analyzed by an X-ray fluorescence machine. And this machine identified the amount of silver and sulfur on the strips. And then we use these measurements to predict hydrogen sulfide and then scientifically validate the photopaper. Then we use these measurements to develop a colorimetric scale for people who are doing steps 1 to 3 to estimate the levels of H2S that they might have been exposed to. And I'll show you that scale too. So taking a step back, this is a do-it-yourself tool that brings science outside of the lab and into spaces where residents living near potential H2S sources can measure their exposures. So instead of just thinking about how the photopaper is scientifically valid or accepted by the atmospheric science community as a legitimate way to measure H2S, I also think about how it's civically valid or useful to communities trying to prove their harm. So this is especially important for researchers working with environmental justice communities who want their voices heard. And scientific validity is only one component. Well, I also address how the photopaper legitimates the harms that people are experiencing, such as eye and respiratory irritation, educates people on how to measure H2S and design their own testing plans, builds community through report backs of the results and sharing stories of exposures near oil and gas, how it garners public and media attention, and then how tools can ultimately improve livelihoods when those in power respond to community concerns, as shown with this tool. So the story of validating this photopaper and bringing it from a volcanic caldera to a ranch where there's oil and gas development begins with a family in Deaver, Wyoming. And their stories of exposure in their area are controversial and often contested or ignored by industry and regulatory agencies. I don't know if you can see these quotes on here, but they say, "When we've had oil pipeline breaks, the raw oil smell makes my nose and my eyes burn, makes my lungs hurt, my chest hurt, makes me really sleepy and slow. You're kind of dizzy and just not all there." And they've also, their goat and cattle have been experiencing miscarriages, and there is an oil well pad right on their property with water that comes from the oil and gas extraction activity and a discharge canal that, as you see, contains hydrogen sulfide. And we know this because they use the photopaper method to characterize the spread of hydrogen sulfide from the wastewater pits. And using this method, they could see how it spread out across fence lines into public areas. And so they placed it for 1 week on the lower left-hand side. And then you see after 3 weeks, it's even darker. So they could show that these emissions were chronic and routine. And it's important to note that the EPA regulates H2S as a short-term accidental hazard. So this tool actually shows and shows chronic routine emissions and challenges those regulations. So then the question is, how can we figure out how much hydrogen sulfide they were exposed to? And then we set out on a scientific study to estimate this. So you see this science is being guided by community concerns. So our scientific validation study started at a sewage treatment plant in its grit room. And this is where solid objects are separated out from sewage. There's consistent levels of H2S in the room, which made this the perfect place to test out the photopaper in a more controlled environment. We had an industry standard durometer that we used to take measurements, and we averaged these measurements and compared them to the photopaper to see if the results were similar to one another. Then we took the samples from the grit room and used the XRF machine to measure the amount of silver and sulfur on the strips. And this is because hydrogen sulfide reacts with the silver to make silver sulfide, which is the brown color. So we found that as silver increased, so did the sulfur, and this confirmed that the photopaper was working and getting darker as the sulfur increased, and getting darker over time. The concentrations match well with the durometer, and then we wrote a scientific paper about this approach in Atmospheric Environment, which is a scientific journal. But what's also important is how to connect the science with community use. So we used the samples from the sewage treatment plant to create a scale for people living near oil and gas facilities to compare the results to H2S in the grit room. And we used an equation developed by Claire Horwell to estimate hydrogen sulfide in the air. And most of the results we used in the field, that we received in the field, were on the low end of the spectrum. So we did move on to monitor other compounds, but it's also important to establish a baseline. And we also used added benchmarks like the average reading in the durometer in the grit room, the average of the photopaper there. And since hydrogen sulfide is corrosive, the level at which the concentration is considered severe by the International Society for Automation. So anyone using the photopaper can take their results and match them up to the colors here and see about how much H2S they've been exposed to. And this chart is still in development by the lab. But what's also important are these other components of civic validation, like education. Participants identified education as an important part of this experience, and we designed an experimental plan together, learned how to deploy the canisters, and people have used the canisters. People have used them before, have posted how-to guides on a collaborative environmental science website and wiki called Public Lab. Anybody can log on here and learn how to use the photopaper tool. And then through this experience, we've built community, connecting people through air monitoring and conducting a report back that led to the formation of a group called Karnes Area Residents for the Environment. And in Saskatchewan, people started to speak up about their exposures and realized that they were not alone. One participant told the news, "Remaining silent can be deadly to the soul and spirit, and obviously to the health." I think that because of this engagement, I have more initiative with less exertion to do that sort of thing. So it really builds community advocacy and builds community. And when we were in Saskatchewan, we worked with journalists to document experiences monitoring the air there. This drew public attention to harms posed by the oil and gas industry. And because of this public attention, one participant who has a facility on his property was visited by engineers who came to improve the well equipment and install more monitors. While ideally we would live in a world where harms from oil and gas development wouldn't exist, we do have to think about immediate concerns and how they can be addressed. So this is what we call environmental data justice, and this is, or EDJ, and this is EDJ in practice. And I've developed this principle with the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative, an organization of over 175 activists, academics, and technologists that advocate for transparent and accessible environmental data practices and governance. And it's also influenced by the FAIR and CARE principles for Indigenous data sovereignty, as they emphasize the production of rigorous, well-documented data that preserves autonomy and positively impacts the livelihoods of community members. And this is what influences civic validation. So in conclusion, we see that sometimes scientific tools do not cater to community needs, but we can develop ones that do. It's important that there's science in environmental science driven by community needs and positively impacts people's lives. And environmental data justice means that the tools are accessible. And then I wanted to end this with a question that maybe we could talk about in the breakout room of what's the place of researchers in advocacy and in community partnerships. So thank you. You can email me at l.vera@northeastern.edu, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Lourdes, thank you so much for sharing with us. We do have a couple of questions coming in, so I will ask them. The first one we have is, do you have any advice on how to partner with media from beginning of a project to elevate impact? I don't even know where to start.
I think so in this case, the journalists found us. So it's important to work with community organizers who also have connections to journalists, and to find journalists in maybe in publications that you often read, and just connect with them, send them an email, tell them about the project you're working on, and also keep a list of journalists and send them emails updating them about the project.
Awesome, thank you so much.
Danny, I'm so sorry to jump in. And I think this is Jude. I'll just add that we actually do help with that through QSide. And I'm not trying to overpitch the organization, but we do have a database of journalists for exactly this purpose. So that's part of our community sourcing. And we'd be happy to help with some of that if you're interested in collaborating centrally with us.
Thank you, Jude. We do have another question, and it reads, the DIY tool you showed us is fascinating. Are there any other community-based / DIY tools for individuals to take charge of environmental metrics in their area?
Can you say that again? What kind of DIY tools?
Are there any community-based / DIY tools for individuals to use to take charge of environmental metrics in their area?
Yes, and it all depends on what the problem is and what you want to measure. And the website I mentioned, publiclab.org, that has a lot of do-it-yourself tools on there for different contaminants that might be a nuisance to you.
Thank you. And I think that is all the time we have for now. So thank you so much, Lourdes, for an amazing talk, and to everyone who contributed a question. As a reminder, we are hosting several raffles throughout Data4Justice. And so for a chance to win QSide merchandise, please visit the link bit.ly/QSide raffle1 and enter code ENVIRO_LV. Our winners will be announced after our next session. For further discussion of environmental justice and this community-based tool for measuring hydrogen sulfide, please join our breakout session accessible via bit.ly/D4J breakout, and all of this will be posted in the chat. So you can just click and it'll be really nice. And so see you all in the breakout session.